Hey everybody, welcome to episode 116 of the Askdap Show, where I answer your Volkswagen and Audi questions. On this episode, we talk about torque vectoring differentials, how to get more traction out of your vehicle, 3.0T supercharged Audi engine reliability, and haldex pump problems.
Barley via YouTube says, are the Audi 3.0T engines reliable? More specifically, I'm looking into a 2009 A6 to replace my 99 B5 Passat, which has 190,000 and runs flawlessly. Don't want to swap out for a lemon.
Okay, so 3.0T, what he's referring to is 3.0T supercharged. 3.0T is what Audi has as the badges, but they are supercharged engines generally. The new stuff is actually turbocharged. So there are the new S4s and some of the other S5s and some other engines that are going to be starting to roll over to that 3.0 turbo engine, but he's talking about 3.0T. So B5. So B5 actually, I'm kind of shocked you say that because B5 is kind of a notorious not reliable platform. If you had a V6 B5, it's more likely. Those 2.8s were pretty solid engines. Then you just were plagued with a typical B8 stuff, which was like, you know, pollen filter housing leaks and axles and, you know, a bunch of different other stuff. But, and I think Charles, the home mechanic, actually shot a video covering some of that. So I'll make sure I'll link to that in the description. And this comment was left on a video that I talked about with common, like cars that seem inexpensive, but they're not. It's always been a popular video. I'll make sure I'll link to that as well. So 3.0T cars. Yes, 3.0T, the supercharged engine is a very, very reliable engine as a general rule, especially for Audi S models. That is in an A6 as well. They put it in a ton of different cars and it's tuned at varying levels, but it's very reliable in general. We're looking to put out an article on common problems on those soon, but the only really common one that I'm aware of is thermostat problems, which is not super big deal. I think it's, you know, 150 bucks in parts roughly, and you know, the labor is not super easy to replace it, but it's not the end of the world. It's not like a major problematic engine by any means. So I would say that's a solid replacement. The one thing you have to be aware of is anytime you're buying a car like an Audi A6 or any higher line car, failures tend to get more expensive as you get to higher line cars. So as cars, the misconception a lot of people have is when cars get cheap, they tend to be purchased because they're more affordable, but repairing them, you know, let's say you had an $80,000 car, not that that is, but just for an example, a car that's $80,000 when it gets down to 20 isn't the same cost to repair your average $20,000 car because the parts to replace it are still in that range of what you would expect to replace parts on an $80,000 car are. So for that reason, that's the only thing that I tend to make sure people are aware of when they purchase these type of vehicles, so they don't end up getting themselves exposed for things, you know, like an MMI unit goes bad, which is their multifunction kind of in-dash stuff for those, but those things are thousands of dollars. I want to say they're like $1,500 to $2,000 just for that unit. So if that were to go bad on you, that's a pretty tough situation. So, and that happens with a lot of models as they get aged like that. So that's my only major concern, but the engine itself is very solid, and I recommend for anybody who's interested, 3.0T engines or the supercharged ones are solid and very tunable. So I'll link to the tuning information for some of those 3.0T engines in the description as well.
Jan via YouTube says, nice video. Is the VAQ a real torque vectoring differential like the Lexus RCF?
Okay, so this was a question on performance pack differentials. I don't recall. We put out a bunch of videos around the performance pack diff. We had the increasing traction one with the OBD11. We had the servicing one, and then we also had the how they work one. A couple things. The increasing traction one, we seem to got a lot of weird questions about with people who are asking like what it does. I mentioned in it that it increases the engagement of that pump. If you're not familiar with how that pump works or how the system works or how it would engage, I did a video that explains the complete system and how it works, which I will link to as well in the description where you can check that out because that video explains completely the system. So if it engages more often and more frequently, that would give you an explanation as to how that system works. So is it a torque vectoring diff like the RCF, which is what you're referring to? The Audi S4 B8.5 had optional torque vectoring diffs. That is not a torque vectoring diff. It's basically engaging and disengaging as needed, kind of closer to what you expect the limited slip to be. So that's more along the lines of that. Torque vectoring diffs are pretty expensive, and they're not generally an option you're going to find on most cars, I think. You know, eventually we'll get to the point where torque vectoring becomes more common. For anybody who's not familiar with torque vectoring, basically what it does is a torque vectoring diff has the ability to allocate power from side to side. So in an example of a performance pack, not an all-wheel drive car like an S4, you would have your differential, and instead of locking up and have forward driving all times or locking them together in some variation like that, it's going to be able to send the power to the wheel with the most traction. So those systems are much more complicated, and they almost generally, and if you take a look here, you can take a look at the Audi version, but a lot of times what they'll have is clutches on either side to allow engagement of each one individually, which you can understand why that would be significantly more expensive, because you take what would be, let's say, a haldex side, which locks them to the housing, and then you'd have to have them set individually locked to each side, which requires a bunch more components and more complexity and more programming around modules and stuff like that for engagement. So it obviously makes sense why you would expect that to be more expensive. So I don't generally expect to see torque vectoring on too many affordable vehicles until, you know, maybe the future will bring that, but not something at this point.
Jordy via YouTube says, I don't have it, but want more traction. How can you help?
Okay, so this question was also asked on the video that I talked about increasing the traction on performance pack cars, talking about the OBD11 coating for those electronic diffs. The best way to increase traction for a normal GTI or even a Golf R would fall along the same lines, although you're less likely to need this on a Golf R because you already have all-wheel drive, is to get a limited slip differential. If you're not familiar with how open differentials versus limited slip differentials work, I'll make sure I link to a video that just has like a basic explanation of how diffs work and that type of stuff. But essentially, open differentials, the power tends to flow towards the direction of the wheel with the least traction. It's not quite that simple, but that's essentially the result of how it works. So which means it's not a great result. When you end up losing traction on one wheel, you're not getting maximum power, and you want to increase that. So you have to get a limited slip differential. That is about $1,000 for a limited slip differential. I'll make sure I link to our Mark 7 ones in the description where you can check that out. We also have a video that we shot on our Project Mark 5 that shows installing steel shift forks on a transmission as well as a limited slip differential. So installing a limited slip requires removing the transmission from the vehicle, breaking open the transmission case, drilling out the ring gear off of the original differential, swapping it over, and then bolting that back in place, installing it back inside of the transmission. You also have to shave off part of the transmission housing to clear, because the open differential has different clearance than the limited slip that's actually a closed housing. For that reason, it's not a job for most people. I mean, we're talking about probably an average book time to replace a transmission in and out is probably 6 or 7 hours. And then on top of that, you're looking at, a significant amount of labor to open the casing up. Drilling out those rivets is brutal. So I don't think that a limited slip differential is an install for the average person, but it can be done, and probably the labor cost probably more or around the same as the cost of the differential alone. So I would say you should probably expect to spend probably $2,500 to purchase a limited slip differential and have it installed, which really, that may depend on the person as to whether they value that mod enough to go through that purchase, but it will give you better traction and will perform much better than what you would expect. And then tires is the only other thing that you might want to look at to get increased traction. Now, the last note I wanted to make about that Project Mark 5, we've gotten a lot of questions over it because we kind of ended abruptly. The guy who owns the car works here. He kind of got distracted with other projects he was working on. So that project is not dead. It's something that's going to happen. It's not going to be dead. We will finish it up once he continues to proceed with that project. It is on pause right now, but it is something that we will have more videos at some point whenever he gets off his rear end to get things going.
Tori via email says, I have a 2016 GTI Performance Pack. I recently developed a fault with the diff. The car is about 23,000 miles. I've had the car stage 2 tuned since about 10,000 miles. My driving style is similar to yours. Don't launch it or track it. Could you provide any insight as to what might be going on with the haldex pump? Is there a history of these pumps failing or having blockages with low mileage? Can you help me get a replacement pump if I need one?
So you have fault codes relating to blockages of some kind. If that's the case, I would suspect one of two things. I don't know. As far as I know, there are not any major prevalent issues around these, but the problem is, until recently, these were actually kind of not common vehicles in the US. They previously were performance pack cars only, but performance pack cars were not available in the very beginning, and then also were not widespread once they did become more available, just because they were kind of an option that most people didn't necessarily value enough to understand why they were good. I would have gotten one myself if it was my preference. So for that reason, they're not super widespread, and I don't see a ton of high mileage ones. I know there are some people, Ryan Johnson is a guy who is a big part of the community in the Mark 7 community, but also I've talked to him a lot personally. He tracks his car with a performance pack diff. He runs it super hard, and the only issue he had was he actually broke the drive flange on the vehicle and actually sheared it off, which means, I mean, frankly, I was shocked that I saw pictures of it and I was shocked that it even happened, because it's such a stout piece of metal that when he sheared it off, it was kind of blew my mind. But the fact that he did that and hasn't had any problems makes me think that, you know, it's a pretty solid piece of machinery. Now, does that mean it's free from defect? Probably not. If you're having that fault, my guess, and keep in mind this isn't a diagnosis, but this would be my assumption, is you either have an issue with the pump, or a clogged, like you're saying it needs to be cleaned, or the pump itself is having a problem, most likely. So it's probably one of those two. Who knows? It could be a bad module. It's sending bad signals to stuff. Any of that stuff is possible. To me, it seems most plausible that it is a pump-related issue. So what I would do is take the pump out, inspect it, see if it is need to be cleaned, try cleaning it, see if that relieves the pump of functioning properly, and then you know, you can do a reset on everything, erase the faults, and then see if that solves your issue. If it doesn't, you may need to replace the pump. We can get you a replacement pump. I'll make sure I link to it in the description below, where you can check out those haldex pumps for performance pack diffs. It is something, just for anybody who's not familiar, we have the complete Volkswagen and Audi master list on our site. It's hundreds of thousands of part numbers. That stuff is all cataloged by us, because there's no easy way to mass scale a catalog like that. So everything you see is kind of entered as we're trying to do our best to keep up with making sure that we have everything available that anybody needs. If you don't see anything you need on our site and you need something, and that's anything from a screw or a clip or anything, if it's available, we can get it for you. We can send you a link to it, and then you can place an order for it. So if you ever have any questions, feel free to do that. But yes, so back to the pump. If those are my two suggestions, check it, clean it. If that's not the case, replacing the pump might not be the worst choice, and then you'd have to go from there, and hopefully that would resolve your issue in that circumstance. Thanks so much for watching episode 116 of the Askdap Show, where I answer your Volkswagen and Audi questions. If you have any questions or comments about the questions answered in this show, be sure to leave in the comments below. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more like it.